Hello everyone, and welcome back to Chess Openings Explained. Today I wanted to take you through the remaining lines in the Fischer Sozin Attack, and I already have quite a position pulled up here. We'll get to that eventually. So in the first lines, of course, in the Fischer Sozin, I went over last week. Let's just do a brief review here. We have, of course, the opening moves of the Najdorf, and then we have bishop c4, signifying the Fischer Sozin Attack. From here, e6 is the main move. And last week we looked at all the lines coming after 7 bishop b3 and bishop e7. And well, actually not quite all the lines. We looked at all the lines after this main move f4. These are really the most complex lines, and there were 2 really critical variations that don't see a lot of play over the board, but are very, very testing to this bishop e7 move in this 8f4 line. And I went over those really, really in depth. And there were a lot of comments on the video saying, wow, this is way too much, I can never play like this. And I did want to briefly just restate that it's pretty unlikely you're going to go too deep into one of those variations that I went into. I covered them so much in depth because if I didn't, it would feel as though I did a poor job of showing really the most testing stuff, but that's not always the most likely thing for you guys to see. And so some of the main ideas here were we wanted to play b5 and bishop b7, pointing out that this f4 move was leaving a big weakness on e4. And so hopefully, if you guys want more of that, go check out that first lecture again. Today, what I'm going to cover are the lines with a different 8th move here, other than the move f4. And then we're also going to look at all of the variations where white castles kingside, be it on this move, which is the second most popular move, or if he castles kingside after bishop b3. It's not going to make too much of a difference to us. So that's what we are going over today. And to start off with, I wanted to save all those lines where white castles kingside for a later well, actually later in this same lecture, and I wanted to jump right into these different 8th moves for white after the move bishop b3. So in this position, exactly, the most common, most popular move is actually to play this move 8g4, as Manny is saying in the chat room right now. And this move at first glance is actually rather scary for black to face. In the database, there are a lot of games after the move h6, which does, for the moment, stop g5, but it sort of just makes the problem worse after the move rook g1. And in my opinion, white actually does enjoy a slight advantage in these lines. The threat of g5 coming and opening up the g-file is actually a pretty strong one for black to face. So I wasn't quite happy with this move h6. There's also this choice of playing knight c6, but after g5, white actually does get a very, very significant advantage on the king side. And, you know, there are other moves like castles and d5, but none of these were really giving me the line I was actually hoping for here. And I did eventually find it in the move 8 queen a5. And this is the recommendation that I have for you here today. 8 queen a5. And the reason I like this move so much is it's not stopping g5 directly by any defensive passive means. It's more about creating more immediate attacking threats on the queen side before white is able to really get this attack going. And I have 3 moves highlighted here on the board: bishop d2, queen e2, and f3. Why are these the only 3 moves I have highlighted? Well, that's because queen a5 has the huge upside of creating the threat of knight takes e4. And so we are, for the moment, stopping g5 through tactical means, because knight takes e4 is just going to be an easily winning position now for black. So queen a5 is the move that I like against g4. Now f3 is, by a whole 1 game, the most common move here. And I'm going to save that for last because I do think that is actually white's best try. let's first look at the tempting bishop d2. I feel like this is perhaps the most natural move to make in this position for white. You say, you put your queen on a dumb square, I'm going to play bishop d2, threaten that queen indirectly, and make you move it again. But in fact, I think black actually does enjoy a small advantage if white does go for this variation. And it's after the move you might not expect. You know, you play queen a5, your opponent plays bishop d2, asks you very politely to move the queen again, move it out of the way of the bishop, and what does black do? He moves the queen closer to the bishop with the move queen b4. And this is actually a pretty powerful move here for black. Now, this is sort of a difficult threat to meet on the knight placed on the d4 square here. There's no real good discoveries for white if you try something like knight d5. Well, I'm just going to take here. This threat isn't nearly good enough. Queen takes e4 is quite strong, and black would be winning. Knight b5 for the moment defends the knight, but black can just very comfortably move this queen here, and then all of a sudden too many pieces are hanging. So these discoveries are sort of out of the game, at least these attacking discoveries. The move knight c to e2 I think is perhaps the main line. I also wanted to mention, if something like g5, we are quite happy to collect this knight on d4, and after takes, we will just drop our queen back to the king's side, and this is just a healthy extra pawn for black here. You know, white can try to develop, but we'll just develop our pieces as well. Knight c6, and after something like queen h5, just the simple g6 is a nice solidifying move that black can employ in these positions here. So, rather than something like g5 or some strange discovery, the best move for white is likely just the move knight c to e2, retreating the knight, defending d4, and discovering an attack on the queen. Now, there's only one game that made it this far that I could tell that Emery Tate actually played with the white pieces, and in that game, black played the move queen b6. I think a small improvement is actually just to bring this queen out to c5. The point being, we are allowing ourselves some lateral defense here, and if our opponent ever tries to play the move bishop e3, well, immediately there are problems here, but we aren't so unhappy bringing this queen back to a5 with check anyways. So probably the best move here for white, well I say probably, definitely, I've analyzed it, is to play the move f3. This is sort of just the best way to deal with this threat to the e4 pawn and the g4 pawn in tandem. But like I said, the point of playing this queen a5 move is we're creating enough threats immediately that we slow down white's threats of playing g5, and we continue that trend now by playing the move e5. And this knight simply has nowhere to go besides the f5 square, and after knight f5 we can just capture this guy off the board. Just for example, g takes f5 or e takes f5, it doesn't matter too much. Black's going to play knight c6, and black sort of just has a really nice hold on the position here. It's tough for white to actually get this rook to this open file with our active queen on c5. We have some pressure along the c file as well with this queen on c5 as well, powerful queen. Bishop e3 for the moment isn't going to be possible, and in the meantime, black is going to start pushing some pawns on the queen side, or even pushing some pawns in the center of the board. And that's sort of where I'm going to leave the analysis here. There are no games in this current position, and while this is a very, very complex position, I don't think it's one that is solved by, more opening analysis. I think it's just a fun, complex middle game position. I don't think white's doing too badly here, but I definitely think black is one with many, many chances in this position. Knight d4, also potential ideas. And black might not castle kingside immediately. For the moment, e8 is probably the best square for this king, but at a later date, you can imagine castling queenside even, once the threat of bishop takes f7 has sort of been dealt with. Just an example line, knight c3, knight d4, let's say king f1 for example, just getting ready to make this threat. We can take here, and maybe even d5, or queenside castles, or rook d8. And this is sort of the way you can imagine this game sort of flowing from here. So that is the bishop d2 move dealt with. Once again, the key move here, queen b4, creating some lateral threats. And knight ce2 is really white's only choice. The queen comes back to c5. We have f3. And then the nice locking maneuver is to play the move e5, snatch this knight off the board, and then just go for play in the center and the queen side. So of course, bishop d2 isn't the only move. Let's take a look now at queen e2, sort of white's second option. And here we are simply going to revert back to some plans we talked about in the first lecture, with playing a quick b5 and going for pressure on white's center. Now, I do believe white should really try and prevent the move b4 with the move a3 in this position. If white tries to sort of attack immediately with the move g5 stubbornly, well, we are in time now to play this move b4 and challenge this knight on c3. G takes f6 is no good for white because b takes c3 comes with a stronger threat than f takes e7. So white is obliged to move this knight. d1 might be the best square, coming around to some squares on the king side. And now simply knight f d7. And if f4, let's say knight c5, and we are defending against any sacrifices. I should also mention the queen being on a5 has the added bonus of making this move a lot less attractive, as now knight takes e6 never comes with tempo on the queen. Just another side bonus of queen a5. You do have to worry a little bit less about these sacrifices. And after f4, knight c5, these sacrifices are, of course, never really happening anymore. And then from here, it just becomes very, very difficult to continue this initiative on the king side for white when you're dealing with all these threats on the queen side. For example, if you just sort of stubbornly continue with f5, we're going to snatch this bishop off the board. This move is a no-go, so c takes b3. And after queen e5, black is just doing quite well in this position. White seemingly has very aggressively placed pawns, but with this active central queen and easy development to follow, black is really going to have no issues here. And the arrows I pointed out just show if knight f3, queen b5 is a very elegant solution, now offering up the queen trade. And if these queens are allowed to be traded, for example, queen b5, a b5, it's going to be black who's on the better side of things here, with this e4 pawn once again being a little bit weak, and these pawns being a little bit overextended. And so that is the queen e2 line in a nutshell. Basically, queen e2, we respond with b5, going for b4 play. If g5, b4, and actually, sorry, I haven't gone over the main variation, a3. I knew I was forgetting something. So if g5 immediately, that's when we can reply with b4, and after knight f d7, f4, and knight out to c5, black has very active play, as we just saw. This queen coming to the center, and easy development to follow. So the more responsible move by white is to play a3, slowing down this b4 move for just a moment. And here I actually think black can get away with just castling. Castling is another move that sort of lessens the threat of these sacrifices on e6, and in that way we are preparing for the move g5 by making knight f d7 never an issue because it interferes with our bishop, because castling is how we are dealing with this e6 sacrifice. And from here, white has a few options. White can actually castle kingside, but this is very, very counterintuitive, so I focused more on the move bishop d2. Just, for example, if castle's kingside, we still want to respond with b4, highlighting the fact that a3 is still pins. And just for example, if knight a4, knight c5 is simple enough. And you would get some kind of open position on the queen side. And the point here is that the play is more really going to be focused on these open queen side lines, with this knight and bishop sort of sidelined, rather than this stunning kingside attack that white is hoping to achieve. And that's sort of the goal here. We want to direct the play over to the queen side. Instead of castles, bishop d2 makes more sense, as I was saying. Got distracted by the chat for a second. And here, now we are finally going to reposition our queen. Our stunning queen b4 move has been prevented, so queen b6 is fine. And then here, honestly, the best move for white is bishop e3, once again trying to highlight that this queen is misplaced. And now I like the move knight c5 once again for black, just sort of staying thematic here, defending this guy, attacking this guy, and making white's play rather awkward. It's probably worth it for white to save this guy with bishop a2, another side bonus of a3. And from here, I do like just expanding more on the queen side, opening files with something like b4, and queen takes b4. From here, it does sort of become this unfortunate game for white, where this king has no squares. If it castles queen side, it's sort of suicidal, with all these open files coming against the white king. If he stays in the center, he has to deal with these issues of knight takes e4, and unfortunately, I do think kingside castles is sort of white's best bet here, despite having launched this pawn all the way up to g5. And once again here, white can still sort of stubbornly play for a kingside attack, but the point is our play on the queen side is also coming very, very quickly. For example, bishop b7 makes a threat on e4. If h4, rather than capture on e4, I do like the move knight c6, just going for rapid development. This knight is hanging, so queen d2. But now we can actually get play in a manner of different ways. For example, rook fb8, or one of my favorites, just playing a5 and sort of going for a4 and a3 and provoking even more weaknesses on the queen side. Note now that white really does have to deal with this, otherwise there are some awkward tactics, such as this, just winning the e4 pawn. And for example here, a5 did have the bonus of defending our queen, so we don't have to worry about this intermezzo. So f3, for example, and from here we can trade off a piece or two and find activity somewhere on the queen side with any one of these moves, or even breaking in the center. And once again, white's kingside attack is sort of just leaving me unimpressed with so many pieces kind of committed to the queen side. Yeah, as far as queen takes b2, especially in this position, we are much more interested in developing these pieces rapidly than sort of snagging this pawn. Immediately knight d5 is actually going to be a bit of an issue for us. We can't really take this guy, just because our pieces are a little bit too awkward here. A little bit too awkward. Falling over themselves, so to speak. So yeah, queen b2 I wouldn't really recommend, even if it is playable. In this case, it's not playable. I like just going for rapid development and creating threats on the queen side and in the center, as we see here. Okay, and so this was all stemming, once again, from the move 10a3. We castle kingside, and when white continues to attack, we continue to expand on the queen side, bringing this knight to c5, bringing this pawn to b4, and then going for rapid development before white's attack ever really gets off the ground. And that is basically white's second option here of queen e2. Once again, bishop d2 runs into queen b4 with attacks to the center, and queen e2, we go back to these lines of b5 and b4 to follow, as we were just examining. White's third option, and I think best option, is to play this move f3, shoring up these weak pawns in the center, eliminating the threat in this manner. And from here, I do think it is black's best option to simply castle. Castling kingside, sort of castling into the attack, but in this case, I do think it is going to be okay for black. If white continues, sort of according to plan, with something like g5, well, now knight fd7, and we have, once again, sorry, not g6. We have another bonus of the queen on a5, pressuring this pawn on g5. So, for example, f4, knight c5, pressuring the center once again, queen f3, bishop d7, bishop e3, and something like knight c6. And I didn't go too deep in this particular variation, but once again, it's going to be a classic case of black just has all of his pieces in the game, and white's breakthrough is not so clear. We're getting rid of some very important attackers, if I can draw my arrows, and I don't see how white's attack is going to break through. Another case of f5, being not such a good move, simply because it doesn't achieve anything, and there are hanging pawns and hanging rooks in the position. Okay. So rather than g5, I do think bishop e3 is a little bit of a better try, not creating so many weaknesses in the center just yet. Now, for example, knight fd7, h4 is preparing to launch the attack further, knight c6 getting developed. I kind of glossed over knight fd7, of course the point being we remove the knight from the threat of g5 beforehand and are controlling this square more directly. Knight c6, also just normal development. And now it's probably in white's best interest to take this knight off the board. If you sort of callously ignore it, I will likely be taking on d4 here and bringing this queen out to e5. And once again, with good centralization, black should be doing okay. And so knight takes c6, b takes c6, h5, and then I do think d5 is the way to go here. And after d5, black is sort of playing in the center to counter this attack on the king side. And once again, I just don't see how white is breaking through in these lines. Black is ready to meet the move h6 with the move g6. And we're going to reroute this bishop out to f6 to help guard some of these dark squares. And with a nice little central advantage, I do think that black is doing quite all right in this case. For example, another move, queen e2, we are just ready to play bishop f6 and get ready for these types of ideas. Okay, and so those are pretty much those three main variations after the move 8g4. Bishop d2, queen e2, and f3. Okay, so any questions on the 8g4 line? Sorry, I paused to read the chat again. Any questions on these 8g4 lines? All right, well then let's move on. So briefly, I do want to talk about other 8th moves. Of course, in week 1, I will say once again, we covered f4, and I do think g4 is the other, more critical try, but I think this queen a5 move is affording black some really good options. As far as other moves, bishop e3 is perhaps a good waiting move, but we can just continue now with b5 in normal play, going after this guy. If f4, we're transposing, I think, directly to some lines from the first lecture. Just a move like bishop e7, and coming after this guy is going to be plenty for black. If f3, black can simply castle here, something like queen d2, bishop e7, and after g4, knight fd7, we get sort of a slower version of some of the lines we were looking at earlier, where black hasn't played the move queen a5, but the ideas here for black are going to be the same, and they're going to be a little bit less threatening, because white has taken the time to play these two moves first. You don't get sort of the rapid g5s that you see in some of the other main variations. Just for example, if queenside castles, knight c6, h4, knight c5, g5, even the move knight e5 here, and black is doing fine. Ideas of controlling the c4 square, ideas of a5, a4, ideas of knight takes b3, rook c8, even queen b6 or a5 are all in the air for black. Of course, b4 as well. Another critical idea here. Other than that, I did see someone in the chat last week mention the move bishop g5, so I just briefly wanted to mention this move. It isn't really the most common move, and I don't think it's very critical. The reason I think bishop g5 is a mistake is this is a move you'll see white play after black has committed to this move e5 in many cases, but with this pawn back on e6, this bishop on g5 isn't really doing too much. It doesn't really actually want to trade itself off for this knight on f6, so I do think bishop g5 is sort of just a mistake. This bishop, of course, would want to trade itself off for this knight to gain control of the d5 square, but in this case, pawn still on e6, this just doesn't make that much sense. Black can continue naturally with something like b5 or knight c6, and just normal, natural development in this case. So g4, queen a5. Someone in the chat is saying castles is best here for white. I didn't actually analyze this one too much in depth. I suppose this does solve the threat of knight takes e4. This has actually never been played, so maybe this is one you'll have to do your own homework on. Just briefly looking with the computer here, it does look as though h6 is going to be perfectly fine here for black. Here white got a lot. Well, I'm not so sure what you're referencing, because this has never been played in the history of chess. Never been played. I imagine play is going to be similar to what we've just looked at. Play with knight c6, going for b5, and etc., etc. Play on the queen side and in the center. It has in amateur games, I'm sure in amateur games, but at high levels, this is apparently not in my database at the very least. Okay, maybe I'll post an addendum next week going over this line, but I don't unfortunately have the prep for that with me here. Castles just didn't really occur to me. It's not the most natural move to play g4 and then castle the king. Just doesn't make a lot of sense to my brain off the bat. But stay tuned next week. I will have a short, brief addendum to this lecture if you are so concerned about this move. Kingside castles. Other than that, that's all of these move 8's move 8 options. You know, we went over g4, went over bishop e3, went over the slightly awkward bishop g5. Of course, castles is an option here, but we are sort of bundling that in with the second half of this lecture, where I'm going over all of the lines where white kind of just castles kingside. Without further ado, let's jump into those lines. Alright, Zayad sharing his own personal secret prep with me. I appreciate that. But yeah, I unfortunately just don't have the prep for kingside castles there in front of me. What about queen f3 after bishop b3? Okay, let's look at that briefly. I think I did touch on that, not in the lecture, but in my notes here. If you play queen f3, so this idea is sort of to play against this move b5, and the reason I didn't touch on this, and I guess I should have, is that you just end up with a slightly slower version of a line that you'll see after kingside castles. And the truth of the matter is, so sorry, I'm actually recommending b5 after queen g3. The truth of the matter is that once you get to this position, white's best move here is honestly just to castle kingside. If you castle queenside, you run into a huge problem with bishop h4 and bishop takes f2, when this pawn is actually sort of rather important, and this bishop is going to trade itself off for this knight on d4 with some really unfortunate tactics to follow as well. So white's best move here is to castle kingside, and then we're going to jump into this position really shortly here. So let's go over the castles kingside variations. So 7 castles kingside, the move I'm going to recommend rather than bishop e7. Bishop e7 is sort of what I was recommending against bishop e3. I do like just playing b5 directly here and then following that up with bishop e7. So we still get this bishop on e7, but I like playing b5 directly just to challenge this guy. And the reason for that is if you play bishop e7 here, then there is this move, queen f3. Amongst some other options, I think a4 was in particular the reason I didn't like bishop e7 first. a4 stopping b5 was just a little bit too awkward for my taste. So b5 first, bishop back to b3, and now bishop out to e7. And so let's start with this move, queen f3, that we were talking about moments ago. And here you can simply just play the main move, which is queen c7. This is the move that I like. And the point now is that you're ready to meet any threats to this rook with the move bishop b7. You're just guarding this square directly. The idea now of queen f3 is to follow through with queen g3 coming after this pawn. And rather than any crazy sacrifices, I do like just castling kingside, bishop h6, and now knight e8. And this position looks familiar probably because we just found it with the king still on e1, and I was saying that kingside castles is the best move. So this is the idea behind all that. Now there are a few different moves here for white that have been played. Rook a to d1 is by far the most common. And here I do think bishop d7, the main move, is quite simply the best. The idea is you are just developing this bishop, supporting your b5 pawn, and not losing track of the very important e6 pawn, which white is always sort of threatening in the back of his mind to capture. And now, amongst the various moves, knight f3 has arisen as the most popular. I think it's also the least challenging. It's the more positional approach, but we'll look at it briefly here. Knight f3, you can simply develop with knight c6, and after bishop f4, the point of white's play now has sort of changed from checkmate to playing against this d6 pawn, but queen b7 is sort of very, very adequate here for black, stepping out of the pin. And now rook e1, for example, to defend, is going to be met with b4, knight e2, and this move e5. After bishop g5, bishop e6, we have arrived at a game between Garry Kasparov and Boris Gelfand, with the black pieces all the way back from the 1990s. But this is a case of that game actually holding up here. Black was doing just fine. In the game, knight h4 was played. And now in the game that I just referenced, knight a5 was actually played, and this gives white a little bit of an advantage. But the move bishop g5 is just fine for black. Queen g5, and now knight a5 with this inserted is a bit better. What's the difference? Let me actually check. So if knight a5 immediately, bishop d5, here, I guess we arrived at the same position, didn't we? The difference is white could have inserted this move, bishop takes c7, and this actually would have been really useful here for white, although he didn't. So you take first, and then play knight a5. Bishop d5, takes. Now this knight comes in to c4. And after knight g3, you have a little bit of some scary business on the king's side, but black can actually go ahead and just take a free pawn. After knight f5, the one key defensive move is f6. And now, quite simply, there's no way to continue this attack on the king's side. Black's pieces are placed too well defensively. There's really no way to break through this sort of lateral defense with the queen and the knight on e8 and the rook on f8. These knights are just not going to be well enough placed to continue this attack. So after the move rook c8, the move queen b3 was played in the game, sort of giving up on this kingside attack and going after some play on the queen side, and it was enough for a draw in this game. g6 drove this knight away, rook f7, and we found equal play now on the queen's side, with white regaining his pawn, but not much more. And they agreed to a draw here. And this game was actually also Garry Kasparov and Boris Gelfand, but they arrived at this position through some slightly different move orders. So once again, what we have here is queen g3, attacks g7, so castles, threatens mate, so knight e8, rook a d1, bishop d7, and knight f3 was the more positional approach, where black can just develop the pieces, and e5 is a nice idea to alleviate some of this pressure. Other options here for white include this move f4, and I do think this is the more aggressive approach for white. It's a legit idea. Yeah, f6 is a really nice defensive move there. A lot of the times when you have a major piece sort of on the 7th rank or 2nd rank, playing f6 or f3 is a good defensive idea, because then that piece can sort of participate in the defense along that 7th rank, defending the g7 pawn. So f4 is another idea that white can employ here, going for more direct attacking ideas. But once again, it's not going to be enough here to sort of rattle black's cage. We can just develop with knight c6. And now it really is in white's best interest to capture this guy. If you don't capture this guy and just continue with f5, we get an improved version where we get to bring this bishop out to f6 with tempo, and then out to e5 with tempo on the queen. and white is doing well in this position once again. F6, G6, and we are actually quite happy to sacrifice this exchange in most cases. This is from a game of Morozovich against Garry Kasparov, and that one continued knight e2, a5, and this exchange was sacrificed. Queen h4, a4, queen takes h7, and then Kasparov actually unfortunately went a little bit astray with queen a7 check. The best move here is the simple bishop takes f6, sort of consolidating on the king's side here. And of course, there are some moves left to be played, but I think black is simply winning in this position. So, you know, hopefully you would be able to figure out over the board what Garry Kasparov couldn't. I say that as a joke, but in all reality, after bishop takes f6, it's sort of difficult to continue the attack. If something like rook over to e3, there are a variety of moves that win, but the simplest is probably just taking here, giving some material back, and playing bishop e8. And while black is not up any pieces anymore, the entire queen side is sort of falling apart, and this knight is not playing, and this king is actually going to end up a little bit weak once these major pieces sort of invade. Other options, if white does capture this knight, then of course we don't get this bishop f6 to e5 maneuver, but we can take on c6, play king h8. King h8, of course, making a threat, and this leads to more forcing variations. If white wants to continue the attack, he has to play this move f6, and now g takes h6, f takes e7, queen takes e7. This is a rather scary extra pawn for black, with some issues on the king side structure, but after a move like knight g7, black ends up doing okay in most cases. This one, for example, was Rustam Kazimzhanov against Boris Gelfand back in 2014, and it was eventually drawn here. I skipped over those last moves rather quickly. Black actually has various options that are all fine, so it's not like this is stuff you have to memorize. G takes h6, G takes h6 and queen e7 are rather important, but from here black does have a lot of options. Knight g7 was just sort of a nice defensive idea, you know, giving this pawn some mobility in some cases, defending some important squares here, and just blocking off this diagonal. Then this queen sort of came in, and black just played naturally with play on the queen side. Okay, other 13th moves here, other than knight f3. White can try this move a3, going to stop b4. Once again, though, you just develop naturally with knight c6. We have knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, rook fe1, and you just develop on the queen side. And this bishop, once again, it was sort of a one-trick pony and is running out of things to do on the h6 square. In a game between Judith Polgar and Vichy and Nantes, bishop g5 was played, we had takes, and just rook b8. And this game was also eventually drawn with Judith immediately playing e5, and Vichy just taking on e5 and playing queen b6. And this is perfectly fine here for black. Zayad is hitting me with more of his personal prep, saying rather than knight f3 or any of the moves I'm suggesting, knight c to e2 is something you can face. And once again, it's going to be another case of just developing naturally with a move like knight c6 and king h8. And once again, these pieces are running out of things to do. A very similar idea to the move a3, with the slight change that the pawn is on c3 instead to stop this b4 idea, and white has sort of gone back voluntarily. Play might continue, bishop g5, bishop takes g5, queen takes g5, and knight back out to f6. And this is also fine for black. Okay, Zayad has more personal prep for me. King h8, he wants to play bishop c1, followed by f4. Unfortunately, though, it's not so easy to do all this, as this pawn is sort of under direct threat. I don't know, maybe queen e3 here, but I think this is just sort of fine here for black. I don't think these f4 threats are coming with too much velocity or ferocity, just more play on the queen's side. Okay, he wants bishop c2. We can play b4. And we could go on like this for a while here, but I do think this is sort of now outside the scope of opening preparation, and this is just going to be sort of a middle game here. Like bishop c1 is a fine move, but this is a-okay. Why not bishop takes g7? Well, we do have this guy defended, right? This was the point of the knight on e8. Okay. So I believe those are all really the 13th moves here for white that I kind of had to cover. Once again, this line was after kingside castles, and this idea of queen f3, we're meeting with queen c7. Queen g3 is sort of the point. We have kingside castles, bishop h6, knight e8. Now after rook at d1, I'm saying this move, bishop d7. Other moves, you can play rook e1 here if you really like, but the play is going to be largely the same with something like bishop d7, for example, a3, knight c6, and something like this could ensue. Or if Zayat prefers, you can go knight ce2 and knight c6 with something similar, even queen takes c6 here. And like I said, the play is going to be very, very similar to what we just looked at. A lot of the time, rook ad1 gets played anyways. And the point, once again, is largely that this bishop on h6 sort of runs out of things to do. It stops having the ability to generate so many nasty threats. Okay, so other than queen f3, does white have other options? Well, yes, of course he does. So queen f3 is a nice idea to play against b5, but we've seen those lines do turn out okay for black after this idea of queen c7. White can also try this move f4, sort of reverting back to these attacking ideas. And the idea here is going to be the idea in most cases when white plays f4. We are going to go after the weakness that this creates on the e4 pawn. So I'm going to recommend the immediate bishop b7 to just challenge this guy directly. And now here white does have a couple options. The move f5 we'll talk about first and foremost. I think this is just a bit of a mistake. It allows this good structure that we've talked about previously of f5 e5 when this guy is just going to be a bit too weak. This knight has to retreat. Black brings this knight out to c5, and white is definitely on the back foot in these positions. More reasonable tries are the move e5 to save this pawn. We would get d takes e5, f takes e5, and here the difference is we don't necessarily have to play knight of d7, which would be rather disastrous after some really cool sacrifices, but we do have some tactical means here of saving the game with the move bishop c5, and after bishop e3, we pile on the pressure with knight c6, and white is sort of obliged to take on f6 now, and we go ahead and take on d4. Now, once again, there is some stuff to know here. White has tried this move f takes g7 a few times. It turns out this is in fact just a losing variation for white. If black plays a few accurate moves, we go ahead and capture a free bishop with check. Why wouldn't we? King h1, rook g8 is very natural, queen f3, and now we're actually happy to take on g7. White's best move here is actually to play queen takes e3, but this allows queen d4. And now it's very, very difficult to avoid the queens coming off the board. Black's going to castle queenside if you try to avoid it anyways, and it's going to be black with the better attack. So a better try for white might be bishop takes e6, which has been played a few times, but after the move queen e7, defending f7, attacking a bishop, defending our bishop, white is simply lost. Bishop d5, knight d4, queen h3, and now any number of moves win here. King f8, knight c2, bishop d2. It's sort of all winning for black at this point, maintaining an extra piece. Okay, if white doesn't play f takes g7, well then it's a bit simpler. The queens just come off the board, and we get very similar positions, except for the fact that the queens are already off the board. Black doesn't have quite as much immediate pressure, but black definitely isn't doing badly here either. In fact, I do think it is black with a slight advantage in this position. What's the decision? To put the bishop on d7 over b7. I've lost which line we're talking about, to be honest. A lot of the time, it's when the sacrifice on e6 is sort of tempting for white. That's when we would put the bishop on d7 here, to make those ideas a little bit less powerful. I don't even remember which line I've recommended bishop d7 in. I think it's been a bit. I think in all these castles variations, we're putting this bishop on b7 in most cases. Except here we're putting the bishop on d7. So here the idea, yeah, it's this sacrifice I think I mentioned. I mentioned when I recommended the move. This sacrifice is sort of just an issue for black if he isn't careful here. That is an added benefit of this bishop on h6, is it does kind of draw this bishop to d7 instead. So definitely be on the lookout for that one. Okay, back to what we were just talking about though. Sorry to jump around. e5, and these lines are good for black, or roughly equal. Maybe slightly better for black in many cases here. So that's the move e5. Alternatively, white can try and sacrifice this pawn with the move bishop e3. And now it would be a bit of a mistake to actually take on e4. I've talked about a similar position in last week's lecture. Here, if you take on e4, you run into this move f5. And the problem now is we've sort of given up on the d5 square by taking this e4 pawn. For example, knight e5 runs into, first of all, some sacrifices. Second of all, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4. And actually, yeah, it is the sacrifices that are the problem here, with knight e6 and queen h5 to follow. So we are not so happy to take this pawn immediately, but we are slightly happier to play this move b4 when this guy has to move. If he does do so, moving, for example, to knight a4, now we are happy to take this guy with the bishop, and the difference here is that we're guarding this square quite thoroughly, so this sacrifice comes with a lot less impact with knight h5 being guarded. If knight d5, this is sort of a funny sacrifice, but we can in fact just capture this guy. e5 isn't doing too much. In the only game I see in the database, d takes e5 was played, which is, I think, the best move actually. F takes e5. And we can simply give this piece back with castles, and black is doing just fine here as well. You might claim that d5 is a little bit weak, but I would argue that b2 is just as weak, and there's no immediate threats on the king's side. For example, knight f5, we can just develop our pieces, and things might begin to liquidate, in fact, with something like this. And once again, black is going to be regaining something over here on the queen side. Other than that, after b4, e5 can be tried once again, but it's another case of we just return this piece and take on c3, and black is doing well once again. Okay, so that is castles, followed by 9 queen f3 and 9 f4. There are some other moves to talk about as well. For example, if bishop e3, you can just castle kingside. And now if f4, the immediate b4 is hitting a bit harder. And it turns out this bishop e3 move was actually more useful for black than it was for white in delaying f4, because now after we've castled, we are still quite firmly defending the e6 square. And so these type of moves do become a bit better, but I actually do still recommend here the move bishop d7. In this case, it's partially due to preventing the sacrifices. It's also, in fact, making this move even stronger. Because, once again, f5, e5 runs into bishop d5. So in this case, with bishop d7, let's say waiting move, takes f5, e5. Now the point is sort of this bishop d5 move is never going to be good, because this guy is sort of important not to hang. For example, bishop takes here, pawn takes here, queen takes here, knight f6, and black has already taken 2 pieces for the rook and is just winning. Okay, so the point here, bishop e3, is sort of a waiting developing move. Black can just castle. And now if white goes back to the normal with stuff like f4, we're happy to play b4 and bishop d7, going after this pawn on e4. If something like queen f3, defending the pawn, we can just develop with knight c6 and go about our business as usual with pressure on the queen side. Okay. Other than that, after castles, white can go back to stuff like f3 rather than going for f4, but I think, honestly, have I already covered this? I haven't. Well, we'll talk about it here then. With f3, we can just develop a little bit more naturally, something like bishop b7 or bishop d7. Let's say bishop d7, just to stop these sacrifices. Queen d2, knight c6, and it's normal development once again with play. Once again, coming on the queen side for black. These lines with f3 are always going to be a little bit less challenging, just because f4, f5 is really the fast way to play. If with f3, especially when white hasn't played 8g4, it's just sort of a slower way of finding play on the king side, and so black's play is a lot easier to come by with stuff like b4 and playing on the queen side, as I keep saying over and over and over again. Okay, so that's bishop e3. As far as other options, if a4, sort of provoking b4 on move 9 here, we are still happy to play it. Knight a2 is sort of a now positional option. The point of this move order by white is to sort of preemptively deal with this idea of b4 and get this knight back to the square on c3 sort of as quickly as possible before black is really well equipped to take advantage of it. Once again, knight takes e4 is going to be not ideal here. In this case, white is just going to take back on b4, but I do like this move queen b6 here for black, just maintaining this pawn. c3 is the natural follow-up to get this knight back in the game. b takes c3, knight takes c3, the simple castles, and after bishop e3, queen b7 is actually a useful maneuver to keep in mind in many positions, and we are pressuring now e4 with the queen rather than the bishop. For example, f3 defends the pawn, and we can go back to normal development now with black, and this is in fact going to just be a pretty good version with these open lines already on the board for black. Okay, so rather than a4, what else do I got for you guys? If a3, trying to stop this pawn from ever reaching the b4 square, the simple castles once again by black. This is sort of the default if white plays a slow move in this position. Now if f4, this is sort of the attacking try. White can also go for these positions that we were just looking at, but f4 is the attacking try to look at. Bishop b7, f5, e5, knight de2, knight bd7, and once again, it's another case of these sort of positionally difficult positions for white that I do think are just going to be better for black in these cases. And once again, we talked about these positions a little bit more in depth in the week 1 lecture. And I think that is pretty much all there is to say on these variations in the Fischer-Sozin attack. So I'd like to take any questions from the chat. Zayad seems to be the resident Sozin expert. If he's got anything he thinks I missed, once again, expect a brief addendum for that castles variation that he kind of threw at me as a curveball, throwing in ideas that were not in my database. Does there follow another lesson? So yeah, of course, we are going to continue this series on the Najdorf, but next week definitely won't be on the Fischer-Sozin because I have sort of covered really all the main options here for white and some very much sidelines that are not often seen. Hopefully you feel equipped enough with the ideas. You don't necessarily have to memorize all of this theory, but there are sort of 4 or 5, I would say, main really ideas that you can play against the white setup here. We added a few more today with these ideas of the early g4. There's those critical lines with e5, and then from then you just sort of sort of play chess, right? That's the whole shebang. Okay. Well, I think we are going to call it there for tonight's episode of Chess Openings Explained. Hopefully you do feel good about this Fischer-Sozin variation, wherein I am recommending an early bishop e7 against all of white's main options. In fact, against just all of white's options, I'm recommending an early bishop e7. Hopefully you feel well enough prepared on that. Stay tuned for a mystery lecture next week on some other line of the Najdorf. I think I might step away from these super theory heavy lines next week, so I'm not jumping right into bishop g5. I know everybody wants to see what I'm gonna say about bishop g5, but I need a week of something a little bit easier than these Sozin and bishop g5 lines where black is just always getting attacked. So we'll talk about something new next week. Until then, thank you so much for joining me on this week of Chess Openings Explained. My name